Welcome. I'm Jim Martin, Chair of the History Department. The Klement Lecture honors a longtime Marquette professor, my predecessor, in fact, as the Civil War historian at Marquette. And I was going to tell you a little bit about him, but it's all right there. So I'd welcome you to read what's on the board a little bit as I'm talking here. But we have had this lecture series for a number of years. It makes me feel old. I started when I was very, very young. But this is the 22nd year for Klement Lecture. And so I'm glad you're here to join us. Joseph Glathar, Stevenson Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, is also involved with the curriculum in peace, war, and defense. He has a local connection. He received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin, as did Frank Klement, in the 1980s. Only Frank was there about 40 years before. Joe is the author of many books, including Partners in Command, Relationships Between Civil War Leaders, Forged in Battle, the Civil War Alliance of Black Soldiers and White Officers, and more recently, Soldiering in the Army of Northern Virginia, a statistical portrait of the troops who served under Robert E. Lee, which is a massive statistical study of that most famous army of the war. His current project is on the other famous army from the war, the Army of the Potomac. Most of his books have been main selections of the History Book Club, and he is a frequent speaker to roundtables, symposiums, and other events. He has held visiting professorships at the U.S. Army War College as an OAH Distinguished Lecturer. He can often be seen or heard providing expert commentary on PBS and C-SPAN. But tonight, he's the 22nd Frank L. Klement Lecturer, and he'll speak on Robert E. Lee, Revolutionary Commander in the American Civil War. So please welcome Joe Glathar.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll let the lacrosse team take a seat, and then we'll... The title of my talk is about Robert E. Lee as a revolutionary soldier, and what I'm going to do is challenge quite a number of scholars who have argued about Robert E. Lee's conservatism. So first I'm going to explain what they have argued, then I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do, then I'm going to go through the problems that consumed Lee's time, and then I'm going to raise some of the revolutionary solutions that Lee put forward. And then we'll come back to those original authors, and I'll show you why they're so bad. No. And that's not literally true, but why they're wrong anyway. That is true. Let me, oh, where's that? Let me do, no. Well, I was going to put on the map. Aha. Here it is. Okay. So first, let me start off by telling you that in his book, Why the North Won, T. Harry Williams links antiquated military leadership with the followings of an author named Antoine Henry Baron de Jomini. Now, pardon me, Jomini was a participant in the Napoleonic Wars. He's a Swiss officer who served in the French army and then served in their opponents. And he became the great interpreter of the Napoleonic War. The problem with Jomini was he was a man of the Enlightenment, not a man of the Napoleonic era. So what he did was he stripped away the dynamism and the fervor, the passion of the Napoleonic Wars and reduced it to mathematical calculations. And so he really missed the critical components of it. Williams argued, quote, Lee, the Confederacy's best general, was also its greatest Jominian. Probably it is because Lee embodied so precisely the spirit of traditional warfare that he has been ranked so high by students of war. Military historians are likely to be as conservative as generals, end quote. He then went on to say that the Brits led the way, and he cites Cyril Falls, Colonel A.H. Byrne, G.F.R. Henderson, and G.J. Wolseley. So he blamed it all on the authors who praised Lee on the conservatism of the British and insisted that Lee was an old-fashioned general. Williams went on to criticize Lee for demonstrating no sense of strategy beyond his theater. The fact that it wasn't Lee's job to formulate strategy for other theaters seems to have escaped Williams. And for support, he buttressed his arguments by citing another British officer, a guy named JFC Fuller, whom he quotes for corroboration. As I said, that's like criticizing me for being a bad dean when I've never been one. So it doesn't make much sense. He then goes on to write, in many respects, Lee was not a modern-minded general. He probably did not understand the real function of a staff and certainly failed to put together an adequate staff for his army. Although he had an excellent eye for terrain, his use of maps was almost primitive. He did not seem to have appreciated the impact of railroads on warfare or to have realized that railroads made Jomini's principles of interior lines obsolete. His mastery of logistics did not extend beyond department limits. The most striking lack of modernity in Lee was his failure to grasp the vital relationship between war and statecraft. End quote. He then went on to use William Pitt as his great example. The fact that William Pitt was never a general doesn't seem to have affected Williams's opinion. He then concludes by writing, the most distinguished feature of Southern generalship is that it did not grow. And in the margin of the book, which I originally read about 35 years ago, I wrote, T. Harry has no idea what he's writing about, end quote. So even back then, I figured it out. And I wasn't even a big Lee fan back then. JFC Fuller, whom I mentioned before, claimed that Lee and Grant belonged to two distinct epochs, Lee agricultural, Grant industrial. Lee was an expression of, quote, spiritual energy, end quote, while Grant was an expression of, quote, physical energy, end quote. Fuller claims that Lee learned nothing from his mistakes in West Virginia. I think he did learn never to trust Henry A. Wise, John B. Floyd, or that accused pedophile W.W. Loring, who failed him in the battle. Fuller claims Grant said of Lee, quote, he is not an imaginative man, and then he, end quote, and then he agreed with it. I think Grant never said such a thing. Fuller also accused Lee of being, quote, no grand strategist and consequently a most indifferent general-in-chief, end quote. I should mention to you that Lee became general-in-chief on the last day of January 1865, so he only held the position for 68 days. That wasn't exactly a legitimate test of his knowledge and capabilities. In more recent times, other prominent scholars have been sharply critical of Lee. In The American Way of War, Russell Weigley bashed Lee by arguing that Jefferson Davis sought a defensive strategy. Confederates, quote, only need stand fast within their boundaries, end quote. But it was Lee in Napoleonic fashion who guided offensives and sought to crush the Union Army. As he wrote, was not the idea of the destruction of so mighty a host in a single campaign an illusion now that the defense had offensive weapons? Weigley considered Lee, quote, too Napoleonic, end quote, and his casualties seeking a climactic battle and the annihilation cost the Confederacy deeply. Later in life, in his book, A Great Civil War, he refused to back away from his early assessment, asserting, quote, he was to prove the most Napoleonic general of the war, end quote, thereby representing talents of the past. Now, other scholars have taken these initial scholars to task, and why the South lost. They challenged some of those assertions. My friend Gary Gallagher has argued that Lee's aggressiveness were clearly a reflection of Southern culture. That's what the Southern people wanted out of their generals and so on. What I'm going to do is take that argument much beyond that and explain to you how I think Lee is actually a very revolutionary thinker. First, I want to go through some of the problems that Lee encountered, and here you'll really get a feel for the difficulty that the soldiers in the Army of Northern Virginia experienced and some of the problems that Lee has to wrestle with during the course of the war. First, manpower. The Confederacy went into the war at a great disadvantage. The Confederacy had 9 million people, of whom 3.5 million were slaves. The Union had 21 million people, almost all of whom were white people, 99% to be precise. And so, as a result of that, what you've got is a situation where the Union has 4 times as many possible soldiers as the Confederacy, and then the Union starts recruiting African Americans, largely from the Confederate States, to serve in the Union Army. So the percentage is actually greater than 4-1. Most of the time, Lee fought with about half to 70% of the Union Army strength. So the Union almost always had at least a third more, sometimes double the number that Lee had. As far as the quality of the officers are concerned, the officers in the Confederacy, like the officers in the Union, very much reflected the society from which they came. And that meant that they largely believed in the concept of bravery and fighting from the front, but they were also pretty undisciplined. And they weren't very good at the administrative aspects of being an officer. That reflected Southern cultural values. You have to understand, I don't want to go into Southern honor in great detail, but anyone who takes orders from someone else is not really a man, therefore is devoid of honor. So taking orders in a military structure is not really conducive to concepts of Southern honor. In effect, Lee commanded an army of ill-disciplined soldiers and officers. The officers were unwilling to discipline their men, largely because they came from the same communities as their men, and they reflected the same values as their men. But they did lead from the front, and they suffered staggering losses. To give you an idea, 25% of all the officers who ever served in Lee's army were killed in action, and another 27% who were not killed were wounded at least one time. So you're talking about really staggering losses among the officer corps. These losses literally did gut the officer corps. Brigade inspections uncovered countless inexperienced officers. The people who were good, who were competent, got relieved, and there's a finite number of quality officers in every population, and the Confederacy tapped that one out. Many of the replacements proved themselves to be excellent combat soldiers, but their obligations as officers ranged far beyond the battlefield. Being a good officer is more than just overseeing soldiers in combat. It's taking care of their men, making sure they're executing their duties, making sure they're fed properly, that the paperwork is done properly so that the soldiers get everything they need in their service. And it's also counseling them and training people to replace you. Those are things that they weren't very good at. And then you had, because they suffered such high attrition, you had really good officers who ultimately got promoted beyond their capacity to serve or too quickly. A classic example is a first lieutenant in the 61st Alabama who suddenly found himself commanding a regiment. That should be the responsibility of a colonel. But because of the attrition that the regiment suffered, this guy was the ranking officer. And he was a good officer, but he was a first lieutenant. At the highest levels, of course, the Confederacy did suffer disastrous losses. You probably know of the death of Stonewall Jackson in May of 1863. But just look at Lee's army in that 1864 summer campaign where James Ewell Brown Stewart, Jeb Stuart, was killed. His principal corps commander, James Longstreet, was badly wounded and out of the war for almost six months. Richard Stoddard Ewell collapsed from the strain of the war and never came back as a corps commander. A.P. Hill suffered from bouts of prostatitis as a result of venereal disease he contracted in his days at West Point. And so the only reliable corps commander was a guy named Jubal Early, who was a replacement corps commander. Obviously, officers and manpower is a big deal, but there are other things. Animals and feed. By the spring of 1862, the numbers of animals had so depleted that the head of artillery in Lee's army wrote that he needed 1,200 horses just for the artillery. There were 1,200 horses short. Now, you would think with Texas in the Confederacy, you'd have plenty of horses, but it's a different matter. You can't bring them across the Mississippi River, but the biggest problem is you can't feed them. Listen to this comparison. The Army of the Potomac had one wagon for every 40 men and one horse or mule for every 2 to 3 soldiers. So the Army of the Potomac, the opposing army, had 2,500 wagons and 35,000 horses and mules. Those animals consumed 600 tons of hay and fodder a day. Lee's army has about half that number. And the Union Army normally fed its animals 24 to 26 pounds of hay and fodder a day. Lee's soldiers got 1/10 of that. Horses got about 1/10 of that. Sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. We'll deal with that in a little bit. In the late summer 1863, Lee complained that the critical supply situation was just destroying his animals. Quote, "Some days we get a pound of corn per horse, and some days none. Sometime our limit is 5 pounds per day." Keep in mind, 26 pounds is what the Union feeds there. So he's struggling to get 5 pounds for his animals. Then he concluded with the words, "You can judge our prospects." Likewise, artillery horses received 3 to 4 pounds of corn per day, far too little to serve for them to remain in the service. So this is a really big problem. It took such a toll on Virginia agriculture to get that kind of corn to the animals that they began hauling corn from as far away as Georgia and South Carolina to feed Lee's army. In November 1863, Lee complained to Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, "No corn was received here on the 21st and 23rd, and on the 22nd and 24th, about 5 pounds per horse." In early December 1863, a month later, the situation got so urgent that they began shipping corn from Alabama to the army. By mid-December, they had accumulated large amounts of corn in Augusta, Georgia. The first 2 carloads, however, did not reach Richmond until January 9th, 1864. A single corps required 3 carloads per day. So that means the Army needs 3 carloads, 9 carloads for the 3 corps, and then you need probably a carload and a half for the artillery horses. And then you probably need a carload and a half for the cavalry horses. So you're probably talking about 12 carloads that the Army needs, and they get 2. It's just not working out. Clothing is a big problem. One division commander wrote his brother, who was a congressman, that in September 1862, 5,000 men had no shoes in Lee's army. 5,000 men. Now, that's not too bad, because September the weather's still pretty good. The government kept purchasing shoes, but they were either made at home or abroad. They were too small for the men, and so they couldn't be used. In one instance, the Army got 10,000 shoes, of which over 3,000 had to be sent back because they weren't manufactured properly. By midsummer 1863, clothing once again reached epidemic proportions. One soldier said that his pants were more holy than righteous. I like that expression. Another one wrote, I'm getting nearly naked. He wrote that to his folks. Another soldier, a son of a Confederate senator, described to his sister, "My boots were utterly worn out. My pantaloons were all one big hole, as the Irishman would say. My coat was like a beggar's, and my hat was actually falling to pieces." One regimental commander thought the Army needed 30,000 pairs of shoes and estimated that half his men were barefoot or almost so. By late fall, troops still had no tents, no overcoats, and no blankets. You literally have situations where soldiers are riding home hoping that the Army will go into battle because winter's approaching, and if they win the battlefield, they'll get pants and blankets that will enable them to survive in the winter. In the summer of 1864, one soldier wrote home, "Our men are shoeless, pantless, jacketless, sockless, and miserable, and resemble Falstaff's army more than any corps in the Confederacy," end quote. That winter, one in 6 in some infantry brigades was barefoot. Now, it's tough to be in the infantry and be barefoot. Some men attended inspections without pants because their pants had worn out. This is in the winter in Virginia. No pants. Let's talk about food. Manpower shortages, campaign disruptions, and wartime refugees limited the number of acres under cultivation in Virginia, and a part of the crop that farmers did harvest was grown in areas that were cut off from Confederate authorities. In an average year, peacetime year, 800,000 to 1 million bushels of wheat were shipped to Richmond. In 1862, even though the city's population of civilians had doubled, and then on top of that, you've got the Army. The city's population in 1860 was about 38,000. So you've got about 75,000 civilians, and then you've got an army of roughly 75,000 on top of that. Despite all that, the amount of wheat that arrived was reduced to 250,000 to 300,000 bushels. So you're taking in much less beef, much less wheat. One full-grown cow provided enough meat to issue a single ration to about 200 soldiers. But securing enough cattle to feed them was an endless problem, especially in the winter months. By mid-January 1863, the cattle supply had dwindled down to enough to last through the end of the month only. How do you plan to conduct military operations when you can only feed the army for the next 2 weeks? And it gets worse. In spring of 1863, when a soldier wrote, "We're pretty bad off now in the eating line. We get old rusty bacon and musty flour and not half enough." One soldier complained that they received 1/4 pound of bacon, some bread, and a little rice and molasses per day. That's not very much food. In mid-December 1863, Lee's army had only 10 days of meat rations stockpiled, and according to Lee, quote, "every pound has been sent up." By January 1864, Jefferson Davis admitted that the Army was issuing 1/4 pound of beef per day, and Lee only had one more day's ration on hand. It's just crazy. In the summer of '64, Wade Hampton, the cavalry commander, captured 2,468 head of cattle from the Union forces. And these were big, fat cattle. You know, the Union has the fat cows. And normally that would have lasted 2.5 months for Lee's army. But instead they had to stretch it out to a month. So what they were doing is reducing the amount of meat that the soldiers could take. The situation ultimately became disastrous. In the winter of 1864-65 and into the spring of '65, Lee's army lived on a diet that lacked a half the necessary protein to maintain muscle mass and provided less than 2/3 the necessary calories to sustain body mass. I don't know if any of you are in the military, but the U.S. military feeds its military personnel in a combat zone 4,000 calories a day, because that's what they think you need to sustain muscle mass and body weight. These guys are living on about 900 calories a day. They're on a slow starvation diet. And we know what people your age eat. I mean, you guys eat 4 gigantic meals and then top it off with a pizza, right? We won't talk about the beer, which does have a lot of calories. So in fact, their diet was largely 1/4 pound of beef, 2 pints of coarse cornmeal, and occasional small amounts of molasses. It was woefully deficient in most vitamins, resulting in weakness and absorption problems. So what happens is they're not getting enough minerals and vitamins to absorb the food that they're consuming. So they can't break down the protein, the other minerals and vitamins, and so soldiers are suffering from skin ailments, night blindness, anemia, scurvy, and diarrhea, all from just not getting enough food. The railroads. I put up a map of the railroads because I wanted you to see it. Lee's army settled in the area just north of Richmond. You can see it. Well, it's about right in the middle of the map there. It's around the area around Fredericksburg. What they would do is occupy the position around the Rappahannock as the south bank of the Rappahannock, and Rapidan as a defensive position. The problem with that is you can see a railroad running from Richmond right up to Fredericksburg, but that was made for that wasn't made for hauling goods and so on. It was a passenger line. So it couldn't sustain the kind of weight that you needed to haul lots of food, and that became a really big problem. Now, the best railroad they had is the Virginia Central. The Virginia Central swings on into Hanover Junction. You see where Hanover Junction is, roughly halfway between Richmond and Fredericksburg, and then angles to the left over by Gordonsville, and then pushes down into Charlottesville, goes down into the Shenandoah Valley, and then northward into the Shenandoah Valley. So that's the principal railroad of the Confederacy. Since that's the principal railroad, though, it gets overused to the point that it becomes a disaster. Due to his overuse and lack of repair, quote, its efficiency is most seriously impaired, so described the president of the railroad company. In mid-March, to give you an idea how bad it was, the line suffered 4 derailments in a 5-day span. And of course, each derailment results in the destruction of the railroad cars, so that makes a big problem. To deal with it, they had to slow down the trains and reduce the weight by about 25%. But that's really a problem. As you reduce the weight in the cars, that means less foodstuffs are coming into the Army at that point. Supplies, as I said, are coming all the way from South Carolina, Georgia, and even Alabama, 500 miles away just to feed Lee's army. But of course, the more you're drawing on those, the more wear and tear on those railroads there are. And so it gets worse and worse and worse. A train, incidentally, can move goods at about a rate of about 8 miles per hour, a freight train. So it's not moving very fast. You're 500 miles away, do your math. You're talking about, 60 hours to get, or 70 hours to get it that kind of distance. That's a long time. And that assumes that you can go 24 hours a day, which of course you probably can't. To make matters worse, the Confederacy has a huge problem. They have different railroad gauges. That's the width of the track. So trains can't move from one railroad line to the next. They have to stop. You have to unload everything, load it onto a new train, and then it can go on. So that becomes a huge, huge problem. The Union, incidentally, has uniform railroad gauges. So it's never a problem. Eventually, what they did was the civilians drew supplies from the Virginia Central, and Lee's army drew supplies from the railroads coming up through Petersburg. You see Petersburg just south of, just below Richmond. It's about 35 miles below Richmond. And you can see railroads coming straight in and coming in from an angle. Those railroads tend to supply the army during the 1864 campaign. Now, to make that more efficient, unfortunately it's not here, the Confederacy decided to build a rail line in North Carolina that would connect Greensboro to Danville. But they built it in haste without proper equipment, without good workers, and the results were disastrous. The line, it was finished, and I should say also, it was built in the standard gauge, which didn't enable the cars to switch over into the Richmond and Danville line. So it was in such bad condition that it took 48 hours to travel from Greensboro to Danville. That's 1 mile per hour. That's unbelievably slow. I mean, walking, you guys, you get 3 miles an hour. And that's not pushing it. So it's pretty bad. The lacrosse team here could run backwards and beat that. So all these things, all these problems became really severe. As far as maps were concerned, Lee's predecessor, Joseph E. Johnston, did nothing to have maps prepared. And so when Lee stepped in June of 1862, he had really no maps. So it was a real big problem. The workload for Lee was also disastrous. The Union was able to figure out a solution. What they created is something that we would call today Army Group Commanders. The Army commander would administer to those armies. The Army Group Commander's main mission was coordination and planning. And they would handle the logistics, they would handle the operations planning, but they didn't get immersed in the day-to-day administration. So Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman didn't have to worry about those sorts of things. They had other people. Lee was an Army commander, so he had to handle all those kinds of things, and the administrative burden was unbelievable. The end of March 1863, Lee was recovering from a heart attack. Now, he had just suffered a heart attack, and listen to the workload he's got. He's confined to quarters. He can't really go out to the field, so he's going to try and do paperwork. He complained to the Secretary of War that he had to read 268 court-martials the past week. That's all the testimony of 268 court-martials. That's a lot of reading, because I read court-martial transcripts. It takes a long time to read 268, I'll tell you. Some weeks later, he complained about his correspondence. So I checked into it. From December 5th, 1862 to February 26th, 1863, his headquarters received and recorded 9,800 pieces of paper. Now, some of that can be handled by his staff, but a lot of it requires Lee's signature, which means he has to read it. He can't sign things he hasn't read. He eventually directed that they try and cut back on the paperwork, and it lasted a little while. From April 10th to June 23rd, it declined to 7,604. But then over the next 2.5 weeks, it soared back up to 4,135. So, efforts to reduce it worked temporarily, but the next thing you know, he's inundated with the paperwork. And as I said, some of this you can pass off, but some of it you've got to devote your personal attention to. That's a lot of paperwork. It's almost as much as a history department faculty member gets these days. Jim, I'm sure Jim was thinking that's about half of what a department chair gets. Now, Lee was not necessarily capable of solving all these problems, but he did take really interesting steps, sometimes revolutionary steps, or offered revolutionary proposals to his superiors to try and deal with these problems. First of all, manpower. How did Lee try and deal with manpower? Well, Lee oversaw the drafting of the first plan to conscript soldiers in American history. Lee's plan was that everyone from 18 to 45 should be conscripted. Congress eventually whittled it down to 18 to 35 and offered all sorts of exemptions. But the legislation that was put before Congress for the committee, coming from the War Department, was written by Robert E. Lee, and it called for 18 to 45s. He requested Jefferson Davis encourage governors to shame men who didn't join the Army. He pressured medical officers to limit the number of exemptions for physical disabilities. When he came across physically able men, his Army officers were instructed to seize those guys and force them into the Army. They used to call them snatch-ups, because you were going around and just snatch the guy right up and put him in the Army. If an officer tried to resign his commission for any reason other than personal health, in other words, badly wounded and can't fight anymore, they were immediately conscripted and had to serve as a private. He's tough. He's tough. They have a camp of instruction outside of Richmond called Camp Lee. It opened on the last day of October 1862. So the conscription law is going into effect. You start bringing in these guys. Through January 1864, 7,153 conscripts received assignments, most of them to the Army of Northern Virginia. From February 1864 to February 1865, when the conscription really ended, another 8,653 passed through Camp Lee for Lee's Army. A lot of the exemptions were they found people to be physically incapable of service. All sorts of disabilities, things like that. Many of you in the room probably have suffered compound fractures in your life. If you suffered one back then, they could not repair it. They had no means of restoring it, so your limb was probably useless or things like that. They also drafted, I should mention, 1,561 free blacks who were required to serve Lee's Army in support duties, not as soldiers. Keep that in mind, not as soldiers. The neocons, I'm not talking about neoconservatives, the neo-Confederates, like to think that they're actually in the Army, but no, they aren't. They aren't in the Army. Statistics up to November 1863 indicated that more than half of all those who reported for conscription were ultimately exempted from duty. In addition to physical disabilities, 2% claimed exemption based on the 15 slave law. Only 2% of all those who got exemptions. The historians make a big deal of this, that if you own 15 or more slaves, you were allowed to exempt one white male. But only 2% of all exemptions were for that. 8% of the conscripts were railroad workers, millers, and farmers who avoided service. That's 8% each. Shoemakers comprised more than 10% of the legal exemptions. And government officials made up 11%. Now there's a surprise. Government officials in cowardice. Even doctors and clergymen had double the number of the 15 Negro law. The category that had the largest exemptions early in the war were people who hired substitutes. You'd be drafted and you hire a substitute. 42% were in that category. But the Confederacy ended the practice in December 1863, and everyone who had bought a substitute was now eligible for the draft. So I guess you paid your money in vain. In the months leading up to the spring 1864 campaign, Lee pared down wasted manpower and placed excess personnel back in the Army. Due to the decline in strength, Lee forbade the election of any new second lieutenants because you're taking a rifle out of a guy's hand. If you put somebody as an officer, they're not shooting a weapon, they're supervising men. So you want to keep more guys toting rifles. The commanding general offered a 30-day furlough to any soldier who brought in an able-bodied recruit, as long as he wasn't a deserter from another army or something like that. With Davis's cooperation, Lee secured pardons for guys who were in prison if they had served some of their sentence to get them back into the Army. And then my favorite is, at a time when beef was scarce, he cut back on the number of butchers in the Army, made them go back and be privates, carrying rifles. You know, if you don't have any food, there's no sense in having a bunch of butchers hanging around. So it actually makes sense when you think about it. But that's the kind of detail Lee is going to try to get more troops fighting. He blocked details. This is one of my favorite Lee stories. The Secretary of War, George W. Randolph, ordered some soldiers to be clerks. Lee didn't know who issued the order, but when he found out these guys were going to go to Richmond, Lee ordered them back to their units. Well, when Randolph found out, he ordered Lee to be under arrest. So Lee was going to be arrested by Randolph. When Lee found out that Randolph had issued the order, he wrote him. And guess what? Randolph ended up rescinding his own order because Lee explained to them that they were losing too many men due to these factors, that you can't take people from the Army and put them in as clerks. You need to take civilians who are perfectly capable of doing that job, but who can't serve in the Army. So the Secretary of War backed down. When Lee learned topographical engineers were assigning privates to be part of their work crew, he blocked the order. No way. You get slaves to do that work, or hire free blacks. But he wasn't going to tolerate that sort of thing. In October 1864, Lee issued a circular to draw all men back into the ranks. Quote, with a view to increase effective strength of the Army, which is regarded as the first importance at this time, Lee ordered officers to supervise the rolls of all those men who were detailed away from the Army and get them back. And in fact, those men with conscripts boosted the size of the Army in October 1864 alone by 2,847 men. So that's a really significant number of people he was able to get back in a short space of time. So thoroughly had Lee scoured the region that a study by the Conscription Bureau on September 30, 1864 had determined that in Virginia, essentially the only eligible males for conscription for the next year were the 2,719 males who were coming of age. In other words, those were all people who were going to turn 17. Those were essentially the only people you had for next year. So they did away with the Conscription Bureau and then made them carry rifles. As far as his staff was concerned, Lee didn't have a modern staff in the modern sense of the word because he was trying to keep his staff small. The fewer men you have in the staff, the more rifle toters you have. And so he didn't have an operations officer. He handled that, and he handled his own intelligence things. And whereas the Union armies tended to have an intelligence officer and an operations officer. But as the leading expert on staffs, Bob Crick told me, at a broader level, I think Lee did well in organizing the way staffs operated at lower levels, i.e. ensuring that each corps, division, and brigade was capable of independent operations, end quote. So he made sure that they were really effective at the smaller units. And of course, Lee, whenever he saw a staff officer who wasn't working, he would jump all over them. There's a great story of Lee bumping into a family acquaintance who was a staff officer. His horse had been shot in the battle, and he was looking for a new mount for his dead horse, and Lee bluntly told him, quote, to go to the chief of ordnance and he will give you a good musket and you may do a great deal of good there, end quote. This guy recorded it in his diary. Desertion. Desertion's a huge problem in the Confederacy, and of course it's a massive problem with regard to manpower. Lee attempted to check desertion by guarding critical crossroads and bridges to make sure people couldn't get past and get home. Lee requested that Davis offer official presidential pardons for lots of deserters to get them to come home, and he even approached the governor of North Carolina. North Carolina was notorious for deserters as Sherman's army was marching up through South Carolina. And so he asked the governor of North Carolina, writing, the state of despondency that now prevails among our people is producing a bad effect upon the troops. Desertions are becoming very frequent, and there's good reason to believe they're occasioned by a considerable extent by letters written to the soldiers by their friends at home, end quote. So Lee urged Vance to try and alter public opinion in North Carolina, which would keep morale up. Lee was also critical in black military service. The single best manpower pool for the Confederacy were African Americans. So Lee went so far as to advocate the use of black soldiers and he wanted them to be granted their freedom in return for their voluntary service. In other words, he didn't want them to have to serve and then remain slaves. The way Lee went about it, though, was really interesting, very much like the U.S. military did with gays in the military. Lee sent a circular letter to his officers to talk to their men and get a sense of how they would react to black soldiers in the Army. Since the Army's reaction was overwhelmingly positive, then Lee took up the cause. He clearly cleared it with Jefferson Davis and then began writing in support of it. He wrote a congressman, quote, I think the measure not only expedient but necessary. The enemy will certainly use them against us if he can get possession of them. And as his present numerical superiority will enable him to penetrate many parts of the country, I cannot see the wisdom of the policy of holding them to await his arrival when we may, by timely action and judicious management, use them to arrest his progress. Excuse me. Lee believed the white population could not supply the manpower for a protracted struggle. And under proper circumstances, he believed blacks would, quote, make efficient soldiers, end quote, as the Union had proven, though most of the Confederacy denied it. Lee's endorsement was critical in getting legislation passed to enlist African Americans. And to give you an idea how important it was, the Richmond Examiner completely opposed black military service. And then when Lee came out publicly in favor of it, the newspaper flipped its opinion that day, the next day in the paper. And of course, it passed in the Confederacy in one of the houses by one vote. As far as officers were concerned, Lee was really concerned about the kind of officers that the Confederacy was going to get. As he explained, it is cruelty to the men as well as injury to the country to commit them to incompetent officers. He began writing governors about this. He wanted the soldiers to be able to elect their officers on the company level, that is up to the rank of captain, but have the governors appoint individuals at higher rank. He came out with that position early in the war. As the war went on, I think Lee relented on that. He saw the merits of having the soldiers choose their own officers, but initially he was very much opposed to it. But what Lee was concerned about was the discipline, the lack of discipline among his officers. Listen to what he wrote to Jefferson Davis in 1864. What our officers most lack is the pains and labor of inculcating discipline. It is a painful, tedious process and is not apt to win popular favor. He explained to Davis how the officers came from home with these guys and wouldn't discipline the troops. And as a result, it was a huge problem. Lee ultimately proposed legislation to Congress that they give him the authority that Winfield Scott had in the Mexican War. That is, the power to arbitrarily remove officers. Congress refused to do it, and so it went nowhere. As far as other things are concerned, human food, Lee began confiscating food in October of 1862. He directed the commissary and quartermaster to begin seizing the food from people and giving them receipts and stating that they refused to give it voluntarily. He also wanted to make sure that they left sufficient food for the families to be fed on. He didn't want to alienate the population. One of the reasons Lee launched raids into the North in 1862 and again in 1863 is because he needed to feed his soldiers. If they're in Maryland and Pennsylvania for 3 months, then that means they're going to consume 1/4 less food drawing from the Confederacy. And so that savings might be enough to increase the amount of food his soldiers got. It's a critical issue. To address the food shortages in early 1864, however, Lee came up with a pretty revolutionary concept about consumption and priorities. What Lee argued was that food that the Army could eat easily, such as fresh and salted meat and cornmeal, should be reserved for the troops. Lee argued that other foodstuffs should be allocated for home consumption. So in other words, very specifically, certain things should go to the Army and other things should remain at home. He wrote to the former Speaker of the Virginia House of Delegates, and he was a high-ranking officer in the Confederate States Army, that they needed an impressment law and careful execution to take a certain proportion of everything produced in the country. This proportion to depend on the wants of the government. It should be made equal and as light as possible, and every care taken to deprive the execution of the measures of all harshness. If it requires all the meat in the country to support the Army, it should be had, and I believe this could be accomplished by not only showing its necessity, but that all equally contributed and that it was faithfully applied. So what he's saying is the Army needs to be the first priority. It's got to get that food, and the government's going to have to do that, and the people are going to have to alter their consumption patterns if that's the case. Lee also carried the issue even farther, and again, another, to my mind, revolutionary concept. He called for the depopulation of Richmond. Quote, all the population whose presence would impede or endanger our efforts should be removed, especially that part of it which increases the consumption of public stores without aiding or strengthening the Army. So he's talking about here are civilians who aren't producing foodstuffs or working for the government, or people like these, prisoners of the enemy or our own paroled men of this class. And I think no time should be lost in placing them in some other locality. So he wants to depopulate Richmond of all but the absolute necessary people, so it reduces the numbers of mouths that are fed. There'll be more food left for the soldiers in the area. That's a pretty revolutionary concept when you think about it, and certainly vastly different from our assumptions about states' rights in the Confederacy. He's advocating the government implement this policy. Lee was a stickler for preserving materials. He was always on his men about things like that, insisting that they recycle barrels and that they protect all property. Sometimes he really hammered them. He wanted them to be careful about carrying around cartridges. Of course, ammunition cartridges in those days were in paper. And if soldiers carried them in their pockets, they also oftentimes tore them, which meant that the cartridge was ruined. So he issued a strict order that soldiers are not allowed to carry cartridges in their pockets unless they're about to go into battle, because there's too much of wasted, valuable ammunition. Little things that can make a big difference in the long haul. These are all critical issues that Lee really hammers on. As far as ordnance, as head of the Virginia forces early in the war, ordnance, of course, is the production of weapons and ammunition. He oversaw the production of ammunition. He expanded the Richmond laboratory and arsenal. But in the fall of 1864, the railroads had such great difficulty hauling sufficient quantities of lead and other metals, the lead, of course, is exceedingly heavy, that to offset that, he got the Ordnance Bureau to begin offering money to soldiers if they would recycle bullets that they found. You know, these bullets are all over the grounds because they're all firing them, literally millions and millions of them. And so if they would dig them up and recycle them, they got 10 cents per pound of lead. Well, each bullet weighed an ounce, so 16 bullets, and you pick up, you pick up some money. In addition, they could recycle shells that didn't explode. That's a little different proposition. If it's solid cannonball, that's great, it's 12 pounds, it's heavy, get some good money. But if it's shell, it's got gunpowder in it, and there you're running a risk of explosion. They also were very, very much sticklers about captured weapons. You probably aren't aware of it, but in that first year of the war that Lee was in command, his army seized 100,000 weapons from the enemy. I mean, and these are good quality weapons. They're not the crappy ones that the Confederate soldiers largely had. So he's able to outfit his troops just on captured weapons alone. Clothing. In November 1862, he began withdrawing shoemakers from the ranks in the winter months and had them making shoes for the army. If the government can't make good shoes, at least I'll use my own shoemakers. In November of 1863, the Army detailed 7,311 conscripts to non-combat work. What they were doing is they get in some skilled workers and they let them go. They let them go do the non-combat work. But as the war went on, Lee insisted that they quit releasing these guys and they keep them. In other words, if you draft a skilled worker, we're going to keep them, but we're going to make them work for the Army. So if you're a shoemaker, we're not going to release you, but you're going to make shoes exclusively for the Army. And he does this with all sorts of skilled workers so that they're able to get more and more people. In a 2-month period in late 1864, almost 1,300 conscripts received detail assignments from Camp Lee for production for the Army. So he's trying to make things himself. Now remember I told you about maps. When he first came in, there were no maps. One of the first things Lee did was he ordered the chief engineer to assign a guy named Albert H. Campbell as head of the Commission of Engineers and Draftsmen. And he was to prepare maps of the entire state of Virginia, which showed, quote, the railroads, stage farm roads, water courses, woods, clearings, farmhouses, ponds, marshes, and commanding elevations, end quote. So he wanted those detailed maps. They started immediately. It was too late for the 7 days battles, but later on, as the war went on, he was able to get really good maps. He also, interestingly, in February 1863, tapped Stonewall Jackson's great map maker, Jed Hotchkiss. He asked Hotchkiss to prepare a map, quote, of the Shenandoah Valley extended to Harrisburg and Philadelphia, end quote. So it tells you where he wanted to go for the summer of 1863. He's already, you don't make maps of places you don't plan to go. As far as railroads, that's a difficult step to take. In response to problems on the Virginia Central, Lee requested the Secretary of War divert 100 slaves who worked on fortifications around Richmond and shift them to the rail line to, quote, to prevent it from failing us when we shall need it most, end quote. And officers were ordered to reduce the transportation to the lowest limit. Just before the spring campaign of 1864, Lee proposed another pretty revolutionary piece of legislation. He wanted civilian passengers to be prevented from riding on trains. It would require a massive intrusion into Confederate life, but he thought that it was essential to preserve the maximum amount of space on trains for supplies for the Army. Quote, I respectfully and earnestly recommend that no private interest be allowed to interfere with the use of all facilities for transportation that we possess until the wants of the Army are provided for. The railroads should be at once devoted exclusively to this purpose, even should it be found necessary to suspend all private travel for business and pleasure upon them for the present. So he wants to control all the railroads, all the railroad space to get supplies to the troops. He even asked the administration to assign 500 laborers under a competent engineer to repair that railroad line from Greensboro to Danville, Of course, they began the work in 1865 and was a little too late. Others criticized Lee for not understanding the relationship between war and statecraft. That seems a little absurd. His raid into Maryland in 1862 was timed just prior to the congressional elections. He was clearly trying to influence the outcome of those. Furthermore, listen to what Lee proposed to Davis about peace. What he did was he asked Davis to encourage the peace movement that was burgeoning in the North. They were calling for negotiations, and we should be feeding that. We should be encouraging that, because what's going to have to happen is before we do some serious negotiation, we're going to insist that they would pull back their troops from Confederate territory. And Lee said, you know, we can negotiate on peace, but it doesn't mean we have to agree to anything. We can keep it as in our independence as the critical negotiating issue. So Lee's actually writes, when peace is proposed to us, it will be time enough to discuss its terms, and it is not the part of prudence and to spurn the proposition in advance, merely because those who wish to make it believe or affect to believe that it will result in bringing us back into the Union. In other words, we're never going to go back to the Union, but let's encourage the peace discussion. Let's have a conference, because the longer things go down, the less likely the Union's going to be able to generate a military force to come back at us again. It's a pretty crafty idea. He's a sneaky guy, isn't he? That's a pretty clever plot. As far as Lee in combat, of course, they make a big deal about him being an old-fashioned and Napoleonic soldier. The arguments are largely built on a misunderstanding of Jefferson Davis's strategy. Jefferson Davis's strategy was for Confederate armies to punish the Union invaders as close to the Confederate border as possible. And to punish them, he meant to hit them as hard as they could. Because if the Union kept getting punished every time it tried to invade, eventually it would be discouraged and stop fighting the war. What you've got to do is make the price of Union victory higher than the people are willing to pay. And the best way to do that is hammer those armies. Furthermore, as Davis explained to his officers, as Confederate territory gets overrun, we lose the supplies that could be produced in those areas. Furthermore, our soldiers' families are now in occupied country, which demoralizes them and is more likely to encourage them to desert from the army. So that's why you want to hammer them right near the border. It's not to fight on the defensive. That's not the plan. That's not Davis's strategy. As I said before, his raid into Pennsylvania had logistical goals, as well as the hope to compel Union troops to be drawn away from Mississippi. He thought that if he went into Pennsylvania and was successful, it would force the Union to start pulling troops away from Mississippi. He didn't want to send his army from Virginia all the way out to Mississippi, because you're sending them into malaria country. That doesn't make any sense. And then they're also under an incompetent general, so that really doesn't make any sense. As far as fighting is concerned, it's actually very interesting. The other part of their statements come from a Prussian military observer named Eustace Scheibert, who wrote an article that was first published in German in 1875. Scheibert asked Lee for his command philosophy, and allegedly Lee replied, quote, "I think and work with all my power to bring my troops to the right place at the right time. I leave the matter up to God and the subordinate officers," end quote. That was Lee's fighting philosophy, as Scheibert claimed it was. Now, there are several different versions of this that have appeared in print under Scheibert's name, so we don't really know for certain. But in 1864, Lieutenant Colonel James Arthur Lyon Fremantle of the British Army described Lee observing the attack on the third day of Gettysburg with these words, quote, "What I remarked especially was that during the whole time the firing continued, he only sent one message and only received one report. It is evidently his system to have arranged the plan thoroughly with the three corps commanders and then leave to them the duty of modifying and carrying it out to the best of their abilities," end quote. So that's what Fremantle wrote in his diary observing Lee at Gettysburg. Very similar to what Scheiber said. But let's hear what Lee actually thought. In a letter on August 29, 1864, he wrote to Lieutenant General Robert H. Anderson, quote, I fear that at Front Royal the enemy was too strong for the force you sent against him. I think in all cases it is best to employ all our available force without reference to the weakness of the enemy. If we have the advantage of numbers, it renders success more certain and the loss less. I hope that you will always endeavor to bring your whole force to bear upon the enemy when practicable, as in that way alone can superiority of numbers be made valuable, end quote. While the two versions don't really contradict one another, they do indicate that Lee fought battles without reserves. And in those days, the way a general, commanding general, influenced a battle once it's being fought is the utilization of reserves. Lee didn't have reserves because he was so badly outnumbered. He couldn't afford to have reserves. He had to deploy all his troops in order to fight battles because the Union had sometimes twice as many men, sometimes, 70% more men, 60% more men, something like that. As far as fighting offensively, as I said, that is exactly what Jefferson Davis's strategy called for. Punish the invaders as close to the border. If Lee had an opportunity to crush the Federal Army, he should take it because it clearly worked towards Davis's strategy. If you think you have a chance to crush the enemy, you do it. Every general does that. That's your job. I don't want to get crude, but your job is to kill the other guys or capture them. I mean, that's your job. You go into battle and you hope to crush the enemy force. To criticize them for trying to do that just doesn't make a lick of sense to me. Lee possessed numerous attributes which enabled him to become a superb Army commander. He had worked and studied his craft over 3 decades. During that time, he developed a thorough knowledge of all aspects of military service and matured as a military thinker from study, observation, and reflection. Walter Taylor, Lee's assistant adjutant general, and a frequent critic in his letters to his fiancée, admitted, quote, he has what few others possess, a head capable of planning a campaign and the ability to arrange for a battle, end quote. Lee was an excellent worker who devoted careful consideration to every important aspect of a campaign. Quote, I have never known a man more thorough and painstaking in all he undertook, Taylor wrote. Lee mastered the art of predicting enemy intentions and plans. He knew what choices the opposing generals had, what their options were, and he gained insight from the decisions they made. Lee formulated an accurate understanding of what the Union Army planned and was thus able to thwart it. 2 tours of service at the right hand of Jefferson Davis in Richmond exposed him to the true strengths and weaknesses of the Confederacy and the limitations of its military power. Better than any of the Confederate field generals, he understood what the Confederacy could contribute militarily and from the civilian sector. He knew that the Confederacy needed to adopt a bold, sometimes revolutionary course of actions to squeeze the most military power from its society. Of the 3 great Army commanders in the Civil War, Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, and Lee confronted more problems and much more complex ones than did his opposing generals. He proved to be an innovative problem solver. His solutions by U.S. military standards were revolutionary. No one had come up with things like this, not even George Washington, who fought under fairly similar circumstances. He suffered very heavy losses implementing a strategy that his president, not him, his president formulated, the commander-in-chief, and he did so better than his peers. And despite all his losses, and this really is a testament to Lee as a commander, despite all his losses, in that last year of the war, the last 12 months, the Army of Northern Virginia inflicted 125,000 casualties on the Union forces in that theater. That's a staggering number. Keep in mind that about 45% of all the combat casualties, killed and wounded, that the Union Army suffered were at the hands of Lee's army. Those are pretty stunning statistics. No commander on either side got more out of its army, and it was Lee's revolutionary thinking and problem solving that enabled him to do so. So the question begs then, as we originally began, why did these other authors not get it? Why didn't they see these sorts of things? Why didn't they figure this out? And the truth of the matter is, they didn't do their homework. They didn't do their research. In those days, it wasn't very easy to do the kinds of research that was necessary. I mean, in the 1920s, 30s, and so on, it wasn't easy to do the in-depth research. More information has come to light in the last 30, 40 years, and a lot of them just never imagined that. And as a result, if you begin to do really in-depth research, you begin to realize what the problems Lee was confronting and some of the solutions that he proposed. So in the end, I'm sticking by my argument that Lee was really quite a revolutionary thinker. Thank you very much. First question needs to come from lacrosse players, okay? I'm only joking. I'll let you guys off the hook. Anyone? Yes, sir.
One thing that always strikes me about Lee, very similar to Napoleon, that he had also, we don't think of Lee in this way, but a charismatic leadership. Whenever Napoleon appeared on the battlefield, he always inspired his troops and got their blood up, and they usually performed better. And I know, correct me if I'm wrong, Lee did this on a number of occasions.
Yeah. Yeah, Lee is interesting in that way. It took a long time. The soldiers didn't warm to Lee. When Jackson rode by, the soldiers would cheer to him, and Lee, they didn't. But then at Chancellorsville, when they reunited the army, there's that great line from Charles Marshall in his memoirs, and he wrote that in that moment it occurred to me why the ancients would see their great military leaders and assume that they were gods, because he had done something so extraordinary, and that the way the soldiers rallied around him and their enthusiasm for it. And then the wilderness, of course, exactly, where Lee is trying to push a situation, so he's riding to the front to get the men to push it, and the soldiers just, grab his horse and pull him back. They're not going to let him go. So it's very interesting that way. Next. You guys are letting me off easy. Yes?
You said something about paroled soldiers. What was his position on taking them back into the Army?
You mean for criminal offenses and things?
No, who had been captured.
Captured, well, they had to be legitimately exchanged, and then they could go back into the Army. Lee would not have violated the protocol, because it's not fair to the soldier. If the soldier gets captured again, then he's subject to execution. You can't do that to your own men. You can't do that. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
I read a book about Robert E. Lee that said that even though he was usually outmanned, he still usually inflicted more casualties on the Union armies than were inflicted upon his own army.
Yes, that's true. And I can't think of any battle that he entered off the top of my head where he had more troops than the Union Army. In the 7 days battles, because of Malvern Hill, the last day of the fighting, where his army suffered very heavy losses, he suffered more. But in each of the other individual battles, he inflicted greater losses. And then, Second Manassas he did. Antietam he lost a little more men, and Gettysburg he lost a little more men. And then the Overland Campaign, of course, he inflicted far more casualties. So you're right. Yes, sir.
Would you say that Lee was any less committed to the concept, or as it developed, of total war in the Civil War than Grant or Lincoln?
It's hard to say because, of course, Lee's fighting in defense of his own territory and so on. When he went into Pennsylvania, his troops, let's just say they didn't exactly behave themselves well, but they were instructed to behave themselves well. And, what he wanted to do was issue receipts. On the other hand, other Union officers did the same thing, and their troops didn't behave well. So I don't think, Lee's never in really a position to to launch that kind of total war situation. But there's an interesting episode in the summer of '64, the famous Battle of the Crater, where black soldiers are massacred. Now, the massacre occurred a little over a mile from Lee's headquarters. And Lee's chief of artillery was an eyewitness to the massacre because he wrote his wife about it. Now, I would guess that he must have mentioned that to Lee. And Lee never issued an order reminding his soldiers that they are to take prisoners of war for all Union soldiers. Now, I have no proof that Lee knew. But it's hard for me to believe that his chief of artillery, somebody he probably spoke to in person every day, didn't tell him that. And the guy was a clergyman. Not that all clergymen are good people, mind you. But just a little dig, sorry. You in the back with the blue. You had your hand.
Yeah, I heard that Robert Lee wasn't necessarily in favor of slavery.
No, he was in favor of slavery. He believed in slavery. In fact, his wife inherited a number of slaves. He released them when by the will that his father-in-law had put forward, but he, you know, I think he believed in slavery. Yes, sir.
This, you talk about the seriousness of this recruiting of African Americans.
Was it?
I shouldn't even say recruiting. Use of African Americans in the Confederate Army seems a little.
It's very divisive, and the politicians aren't keen on it. Some of the most, as one of them, I think it was Howell Cobbs said in the halls of Congress, if slaves make good soldiers, then our whole premise for the Confederacy is wrong. So there's a lot of division, but you can imagine the soldiers being and officers supporting it because they know they need manpower, and any manpower they can get, they'll take.
But it's clearly not a volunteer situation, and you're going to use them as cannon fodder, essentially.
Well, it's just the same as you use your own soldiers as cannon fodder.
Well, I don't know. I think it was worse. I think it was worse.
Well, we don't know. We don't know.
I mean, there's an example in Vicksburg when the Confederates know that the Union's mining, and so they pull out their men to countermine and put in slaves. And the mine goes up, and of course, most of the slaves are killed.
Yeah, I never read about that. But it wouldn't surprise me. But that we just don't know what Lee would have, how Lee would have used the black soldiers. He got small numbers of them. There were about 2,000 involved or 1,200 or something like that involved in the Appomattox campaign. But they weren't in the thick of battle or anything like that. They were largely, wagoneers and things like that. Yes, sir.
You were talking about the lack of shoes in Lee's army. I've heard contrary opinions about the need for the shoes drawing Lee's army into Gettysburg. Do you have an opinion about that?
Yes, it's true. Harry Heath's men went into Gettysburg looking for shoes. What they didn't know is that a Confederate force had already been through Gettysburg. You have to understand that when Lee invaded Gettysburg, he had to disperse his forces because he had to feed off the countryside. You can't keep your army consolidated and gather enough food as you go. So you have to disperse it. And so Heath's part of A.P. Hill's corps, and Ewell's corps had already gone through. Ewell was all the way up in Harrisburg when Gettysburg happened, and he began concentrate, or part of his troops were up by Harrisburg when they got ordered to unite at Gettysburg, and the reason was that the Union Army was now advancing on them. So they don't know what's going on in other units. Yes.
Is there any indication of how much Lee might have relied on experiences in the Mexican-American War? Because it seems that there's especially similarities and problems of manpower and discipline with the U.S. Army is always outnumbered in Mexico, but then also you have these volunteer soldiers that are always under Lee.
I think Lee learned an enormous amount about how to be a general officer from Winfield Scott. I think Lee is Winfield Scott's favorite soldier. Winfield Scott writes a letter to the Secretary of War in the late 1850s that in his opinion Lee's the best soldier in the United States Army. And this is well before the secession crisis. So Winfield Scott thinks Lee's the greatest, and I think it's clear that Lee thinks Winfield Scott's a true master. And so I think he learns a lot of things, like what Winfield Scott did with regard to officers who proved to be incompetent. You don't want to have to convene a court-martial because it takes too much time, and then you have to have hearings and so on. What Lee wants is a panel of officers who can look into the case and make a decision, and the guy's removed immediately. And also, if you have a court-martial, the decision doesn't go into effect until it's approved back in Lee's case in Richmond. So that's going to take too long. He needs these people out of there right away, and that's why he wants that kind of authority, but the Confederate Congress won't give it to him. And there are lots of other things where you see him drawing on Winfield Scott's experience. I actually think Winfield Scott is a really important influence in Lee's decision-making and his understanding of his responsibilities as an Army commander. Yes, sir?
I was going to say, Lee also, it seems on a couple of occasions, shows his concern for other theaters. You mentioned that some authors didn't give him credit there. When he sends Longstreet's Corps to take part in the Chickamauga campaign.
Exactly. And remember, T. Harry Williams said he didn't understand the value of railroads. They didn't walk to Atlanta, Ace. You know.
Also, I believe one of the reasons of the campaign, one of the motivations for the campaign in Pennsylvania was to try and take the pressure off Vicksburg.
Yes, that's exactly right. Lee felt like if he was successful there, it might force the Union to siphon large numbers of troops away from that area. Anyone else?
I think trash talking Terry Williams is a good place to stop.
Yeah.
Okay.
Frank Clement went to school with Terry Williams in Wisconsin in the 1940s. So thank you, Joe. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.